Good afternoon, folks. Take a few moments to let people join the webinar. All right, I'm sure a few folks will continue to trickle in, but since we've got a critical mass of attendees joining, I will kick it off and just welcome folks to our first webinar on the updated climate science leading up to the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee's latest report on the impacts of climate change in Maine. We're excited to have you here today to kick off our webinar series. I am going to share my screen so you can see where we are in this series and the next few webinars that will be coming up after this. So hopefully you are all here today for our first webinar, Climate and Human Dimensions. We have 2 more webinars coming up in the series, Forests, Biodiversity, and Agriculture, and then another one about sea level rise and marine systems. So you don't want to miss this. Lots of exciting information and a great chance to hear from our scientific experts and to ask them questions. So please, if you're interested in signing up for additional webinars, you can find these on our Maine Climate Council calendar webpage, which I think Ansley will drop in the chat just now in case you're not sure where to find that. And really, I want to welcome you today to our first webinar. Just a couple of notes before we get started, before I pass it on to our scientific panel. We will be having a question and answer session after the panelists present. So be prepared to put your questions into the Q&A feature, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we will get to those questions once the panelists are finished. We will send out the slides after the webinar, and we will also post the recording of this webinar on our Maine Climate Council YouTube channel, so you can revisit it and share it with anyone who might have missed this webinar. So without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Susie Arnold from our Scientific and Technical Subcommittee, who will introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Molly, and welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us at noon today. I'm going to share my screen and just provide you with a really quick overview of the Climate Council and the role of the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee. Again, as Molly mentioned, my name is Susie Arnold. I work at the Island Institute as their senior ocean scientist, and I also direct the Center for Climate and Community at the Island Institute. I'm here in my capacity as one of the co-chairs of the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee of the Maine Climate Council, and I co-chair this group with Ivan Fernandez and Steve Dixon. They will be the hosts of the following 2 webinars that Molly mentioned. So for those who aren't familiar with the Maine Climate Council and the process, I just wanted to provide you with a little bit of that context. So the Maine Climate Council is composed of about 39 members, and informing the work of the Maine Climate Council are 2 subcommittees, the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee, and you'll hear from members of this committee today, and also the Equity Subcommittee. Importantly, the Equity Subcommittee's role is to really ensure that the climate strategies that are proposed in Maine's Climate Action Plan provide benefits across diverse populations of Maine. Then we also have 6 working groups that are made up of folks with expertise in different disciplines, including transportation, buildings, infrastructure and housing, energy, community resilience, coastal and marine, and natural and working lands. So for example, I sit on the Maine Climate Council. I'm the governor's appointee who has expertise in marine science, and I also participate on the STS, and I also participate in the Coastal and Marine Working Group. So just to give you an example of the people power kind of behind the work of the Climate Council. And for those of you who haven't seen this, this is what the Climate Council produced last time around. It's called Maine Won't Wait. It's the climate action plan that came out in 2020. So what is the work of the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee? Well, there's actually law to identify our charge, and that is to identify, monitor, study, and report out to the council and to the working groups findings and recommendations related to climate change in the state and its effects on the state's climate, species, marine and coastal environments, and natural landscapes, and on the oceans and other bodies of water. So what we did last time around was in the first year of the Climate Council process, we produced a very comprehensive report on the scientific assessment of climate change and its effects in Maine. Now, this was almost 400 pages. And so that's why we do things like we're doing today to help summarize the information that goes into these dense reports. In 2021, we provided a very brief update. You can see it's closer to 20 pages. And we are right now in the final stages of producing the next scientific assessment, which is informing the work of this round of climate planning in the state. And it should be released any day now. It's in the graphic design stage. We were hoping to have it for today's first webinar, but hopefully it will be out for the next two and for sure out by the next Maine Climate Council meeting in June. So today we're all here to hear from a few of the experts on the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee. So first, we're going to hear about the impacts of climate change on the climate in Maine. And we'll hear from Sean Birkel, who's the Maine State Climatologist and is also an assistant professor at the University of Maine. Then we'll hear about the human dimension of climate change from Cindy Isenhour, who's a professor of anthropology and climate change, also at the University of Maine. And last but not least, we'll hear from Rebecca Lincoln about the impacts of climate change on human health. And Rebecca is an environmental epidemiologist at the Maine Center for Disease Control. So without further ado, we can go over to Sean.
Oh, thank you, Susie. And good afternoon, everyone. Bear with me for a moment while I share my screen. And do you see my slides? I see nods. Okay, great.
Yep, you might need to make them bigger, Sean.
Yep.
There you go, perfect.
Great. Okay. Well, as Susie mentioned, I am an assistant professor in the Maine State Climatologist at the University of Maine. And I have a joint appointment between the Climate Change Institute and Cooperative Extension. And I do a variety of work in those roles, including in the extension role, outreach, and primarily with my state climatologist appointment. And I also do climate research. And in the next few minutes, what I'd like to do is step through some of the key scientific information on climate change in Maine, beginning with temperature and precipitation over the historical interval going back to the late 1800s. In brief, Maine's climate is getting warmer and wetter. And in terms of temperature, if we examine the annual signal since 1895, this is from data collected from surface observations around the state that are put into a database maintained by NOAA, from which we can produce statewide averages. And we can look at the annual average change in statewide near surface temperature over time. And you can see that the temperature on a linear trend has increased by about 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit over that period. There's significant year-to-year variability, and there's also decade scale variability, but the overall warming trend is associated with greenhouse gas emissions. And the 10 warmest years have all occurred since 1998. And you can see circled the value for 2023, which ranks second. And over this century, the warming is projected to be 2 to 10 degrees from the recent climate by 2100, depending on the greenhouse gas emissions scenario that unfolds worldwide. During the same interval, precipitation has also increased overall by about 6 inches since 1895, and that's on annual time scale. So on average in a given year, there's about 6 inches more precipitation accumulated through the year than there was a century ago. And this too has significant year-to-year variability and decade or sub-decade scale variability. We've all experienced an increase in heavy precipitation events in recent years, particularly over the last 2 decades. But I think all of us have now experienced heavy precipitation events that cause localized flooding, road damage, and also contributes to in other infrastructure damage. Typically, heavy precipitation based on daily measurements is based on 2 inches or more per day of precipitation fall. But some storms, some weather events can certainly produce even more than that, 3, 5, and even over 5 inches per day. And there are a number of examples in recent years. Projected increases in annual precipitation ranges between 5 and 14%. And so this overall trend of the past 100 years is expected to continue. And now if we talk about how the changing climate manifests over the annual cycle, we'll focus mostly on temperature here. This figure shows the mean annual temperature cycle for 3 different climate periods. The blue line is for the 100-year average, 1901 to 2000. The orange line is for the climate average from 2010 to 2023, so a recent climatology. And the red line is for the temperature climate projected out to 2050. And on this chart, the y-axis is temperature in Fahrenheit, and of course the months on the x-axis. This dashed line here is 32 degrees Fahrenheit, and this is shown on the graph because it's instructive to have a datum for seeing how the relative length of the warm season versus the cold or the winter season changes. As the climate warms, on this graph, the distance increases along the 32 Fahrenheit line, so that the melting freezing line. And so in the real world, that is that the warm season is getting longer in a relative sense as the winter season is getting shorter in terms of the duration of snow and ice cover. And this change over the past century is about 2 weeks. And we see this as a later freeze up of lakes in the year, rather than mid to late November, freeze up occurring in December, some years, and certainly in the southern half of the state, maybe into January, but also earlier lake ice out, shorter duration of snow cover, and also, particularly in the southern half of the state, less reliable snow cover throughout the winter season, because there are more days that in which temperature can get above freezing. There are also implications for hydrology, but in the interest of time, I'll move on to the next slide. Heavy precipitation events. I wanted to show an example. This is for precipitation observations from the Bangor International Airport in 2022, excuse me, shows the daily values. And just to highlight what one of these heavy precipitation events looks like, between October 14 and 15, within a 24-hour period, however, extending from one day into the next, there's a total of 5 inches of rainfall shown here on this analysis of accumulated precipitation. And you can also see that a large area of the state had in excess of 3 inches of precipitation during this event. It's events such as these that we're starting to see more of. And so in this case, that particular event, there was 1.8 inches on the 14th, and then overnight, there was an additional 3.2 inches. And here's a photograph of road damage. And there are many examples of these now. And of course, we also saw that with the recent storms in December and January, the December 18 storm, for example, there was heavy precipitation associated with that. And in addition to wind damage and other aspects, particularly along the coast, that we could discuss. I also wanted to highlight that it's not just weather scale extremes that are increasing, but also seasonal scale extremes. And a really good example, two good examples of that presented themselves just in the last few years. There was in 2020, for the period May through September, which approximates the growing season, that was the driest May through September on record on a statewide mean. And then 3 years later, last year, 2023, that was the second wettest growing season. Two extremes, and it highlights the need in the changing climate to be able to manage these extremes on different timescales, on managing weather timescale extremes, but also seasonal extremes that can have a major impact, especially in the case of drought versus a lot of rain, a lot of impacts to agriculture and, of course, water resources. These extremes are being driven by warming that's also associated with ocean warming and an intensification of the hydrologic cycle. That is the cycle of water evaporating from the ocean surfaces, becoming entrained in the atmosphere, and eventually raining down or precipitating out from the atmosphere to go back into rivers and streams, where it then goes back to the ocean. In a warmer climate, this cycle is intensified. And also in a warmer atmosphere, there's an increased holding capacity for, there's approximately a 7% increase in water holding capacity for 1 degree Celsius or 1.8 degree Fahrenheit warming. Warming is projected to increase storm intensities, but changes in frequency are uncertain. So along the theme of increasing extremes, from historical analyses, the trend in frequency there's not yet a clear signal in that. Intensities are increasing, and projected to increase is one of the keys. And of course, from the recent storms in December and January, and also a couple of impactful storms after that, there's great concern about how do we manage when major events like this happen, and what might the changes be in the future in a warming climate. Further research is needed to understand this in its entirety, but we can expect, based on the information now, that the intensities of extratropical cyclones, middle latitude storms, expected to increase, but the frequency is uncertain. So whether these will become more or less common in any given year. To highlight the key points, Maine's climate is getting warmer and wetter with more extremes. Heavy precipitation events on both the weather time scales are becoming more common, associated with the intensifying hydrologic cycle. We're also seeing seasonal scale extremes, such as, for example, the 2020 drought and the 2023 deluge, as we might consider it. And in terms of storms, particularly during the cold season, extratropical cyclones, intensities are expected to increase, but we're not certain yet on the frequencies, and that's an active area of research. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sean. We will now turn it over to Cindy.
Great. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for having me. Just want to make sure that you are going to be able to see the right screen here. Let's give it a try. How's that look?
Looks great.
Okay, awesome. Okay, well, hi again. My name is Cindy Isenhour. I am a joint appointed professor in anthropology and at the Climate Change Institute at the University of Maine. So today I have the honor of summarizing the key findings related to the human dimensions of climate change here in Maine. While we often tend to think about climate change as an environmental problem, it is ultimately a human story. Human activities have changed the chemical composition of our atmosphere, triggering, as you heard from Sean, shifts in all sorts of Earth systems. And these come with significant impacts on communities around the world, some of whom bear very little responsibility for generating the problem. We're certainly feeling the impacts of climate change here in Maine as projections for increased storm severity, sea level rise, shorter winters, and more frequent high heat events have been realized. But it's also a human story because if it was human systems that caused the problem, then we are also ultimately the solution. Luckily, we have some incredible folks across the state who are working to understand the many human dimensions of climate change, from studies of the drivers of emissions and the effects of alternative energy policies, to scholars working on nature-based solutions and how to build community-level resilience in rural communities. Our working group, seen here, drew upon that recent scientific output to synthesize key findings related to 3 subject areas. First, our report covers human health impacts, which my colleague Rebecca will be presenting in just a few minutes. Second, we analyze research related to the social and economic impacts of climate change, including analyses of differential levels of vulnerability across the state. Third, we focused on research which identifies key enablers of successful resilience building and adaptation programs. Turning first to the social and economic impacts, it seems quite clear that climate change is no longer a problem of the future. We can observe that communities across the state are already being affected. For example, recent economic projections suggest that Maine may have among the highest increase in home insurance rates following the recent climate-exacerbated storms this winter. This tracks with recent quantifications of the social cost of carbon. This measurement calculates the monetized damages associated with each increment of additional CO2 emissions. Those costs have recently been revised upwards with an estimate of $185 per ton, reflecting these costs that we see linked to property damages, medical expenses, emergency response, damaged infrastructure, and negative effects on our natural resource industries. The science is crystal clear that the cheapest and most effective way to reduce those costs is to mitigate emissions to limit warming. But the costs are also more than monetary, as we see threats to special places, ways of life, our heritage and our culture, all notions that are so essential to our sense of well-being. It is clear that while we are improving our understanding of climate systems and can project shifts in temperatures, precipitation, and sea level rise, understanding how those changes will intersect and interact with our social and economic systems is less certain. There's a high level of certainty that there will be an increase in demand for governmental services as communities work to respond to climate impacts and to build future resilience. But there are also market responses to consider. Some are hopeful, others less so. For example, alternative energy markets have already demonstrated a measurable response, contributing to economic growth and employment. On the flip side, insurance markets are also actively responding to climate threats with the potential for negative impacts for families and municipalities. Market responses in other sectors are difficult to predict and require more research. For example, Maine's housing market is already strained, and there are many unknowns, including the market's response to migration patterns, to the impacts of storm events, to increased insurance rates, and to the relationship between the housing sector and shifts in energy infrastructures that might affect heating and cooling practices. As we look to the impacts of climate change, whether they present risk to our social systems, our economic systems, and/or to human lives and health, it's also important to understand that some communities and individuals are more vulnerable to climate change than others. Levels of vulnerability are not just reflections of exposure to climatic events like sea level rise or high heat events. For example, we understand that while all people who live and work on Maine's coastlines are subject to physical risks of sea level rise and climate-exacerbated storm surges, some individuals, families, and communities are much more vulnerable to those same risks than others. This is because vulnerability is also a function of social factors like income, mobility, age, and access to services. Some Mainers are also more sensitive to risk because they lack adaptive capacity, including things like strong social networks, local government capacity, and climate-related information. Luckily, we have some amazing researchers here in Maine and across northern New England who've been working to identify where vulnerability exists. As our research progresses, it will also be increasingly important to develop an understanding of why that vulnerability exists so that we can identify the root causes, address them, and get to the important work of building long-term capacity and resilience. I really like this figure from Thomas and colleagues published in 2019. Here we see 2 scenarios. In the upper left, we see that the physical exposure to climate events and the sensitivity of the individual or community challenges or squeezes adaptive capacity, producing more vulnerability. In the lower figure, we see that adaptive capacity is actively built through, for example, planning, collective action, and improved resource access. In this scenario, adaptive capacity pushes out or limits the sensitivity and exposure, resulting in reduced vulnerability. Our working group would like to emphasize that case studies from around the world suggest that addressing differential levels of vulnerability really does matter. Studies show that sometimes adaptation and resilience projects, no matter how well intended, can exacerbate vulnerability for some groups, particularly when they don't account for local knowledge or diverse perspectives. We also understand through empirical observation and case study methodologies that vulnerability can be reduced through inclusive and participatory adaptation planning. To have the best chance of building resilience, people and communities must be empowered to design solutions that are sensitive to cultural and place-based needs, values, and priorities. Finally, the existing research is also hopeful in that it suggests that by taking actions designed to actively reduce vulnerability, we can often achieve co-benefits that lead to more effective climate action in both the adaptation and the mitigation space. Through, for example, and this is just a couple of many, less carbon intensive and more climate resilient localized agricultural systems, or more robust reuse and repair networks. Our synthesis report also includes a section on the key enablers of adaptation and resilience. In it, we build upon the latest findings of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which synthesized research from around the world, including important studies conducted here in Maine. In their report on adaptation, they identified the importance of not only building out technical infrastructures like storm breaks or more accessible healthcare systems or better heating and cooling systems, but also of building out strong social infrastructures or human institutions designed to improve resilience. Work here in Maine provides strong validation for their findings. We have Maine-based research which has illustrated the importance of building social capital in communities, of creating infrastructures for collaboration and capacity building across municipalities. These studies point to the importance of also building strong infrastructures and protections to ensure participatory governance, to make sure that people not only have a seat at the table, but also the ability to impact collective decisions. The IPCC report also identified several key enablers of adaptation success. These include good information about impacts and solutions, strong political commitments and leadership, making sure that our planning structure is institutionalized, policies with clear goals, financial resources, and I'd like to highlight in particular, because it's consistent with the rest of our report, that it also alludes to systems to ensure inclusive governance of climate adaptation programs and policies. We see strong evidence that Maine and communities around the state are working towards these key enablers of adaptation success. We also recognize that there is much more work to be done. Many communities need additional capacity building and support to build more climate resilient physical and human infrastructures to ensure that this human story of climate change has a happy ending for all of our grandchildren, children, and future relations. Thanks, guys. That's it for me.
Thank you so much, Cindy. And then finally, we'll pass it over to Rebecca Lincoln to talk about climate and human health.
Thank you so much. Give me a moment to just share my screen here and let me know if that is working.
Looks great, Rebecca.
Great, thank you. So good afternoon. My name is Rebecca Lincoln, and as Susie said, I'm an environmental epidemiologist at the Maine Center for Disease Control and Prevention, and I'll be discussing the scientific and technical subcommittee's findings on human health impacts of climate change this afternoon. So I'll be highlighting 5 main points from our section of the forthcoming report, starting with extreme weather and health impacts. So the first points I want to emphasize are that we continue to see impacts of extreme weather on human health in Maine as well as elsewhere. It's projected that Maine will experience more frequent and severe heat events in the future, and research in progress suggests that here in Maine, men and middle-aged adults experience disproportionate rates of heat illness when the weather gets hot in the summer, and that working outdoors or in a hot environment is also a significant risk factor. We've also seen that recent extreme heat in temperate areas of the US, most notably the Pacific Northwest in 2021, have caused significant morbidity and mortality. And these events show the risks that extreme heat can present in areas with a climate like Maine's and highlight the ongoing need for adaptation for these types of events. We've also seen accumulating evidence for the variety and significance of health impacts caused by extreme heat exposure, such as adverse pregnancy, birth, and pediatric outcomes, kidney disease, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and mental and behavioral health outcomes. And other types of extreme weather events can also have significant impacts. For example, the severe storm we experienced on December 18th here in Maine caused at least 4 confirmed deaths, as well as dozens of emergency department visits for injuries, hypothermia, carbon monoxide poisoning due to improper generator use, mental and behavioral health outcomes, and outcomes associated with interrupted access to prescription medications, electric-powered medical devices, and medical care. We also see increasing evidence in the literature for a wide range of adverse mental health impacts from direct exposure to a climate hazard, such as an extreme storm or heat wave, as well as indirectly through climate anxiety, especially among young people. And at the same time, rates of diagnosable mental health disorders remain generally high in Maine, and there are stubborn and persistent gaps between the existing need and available services. These findings suggest to us that efforts to expand and improve Maine's mental health services need to account for the potential mental health impacts of a changing climate. And likewise, that emergency preparedness efforts should account for the likely need for additional mental health services during and following natural disasters and other emergencies. Another notable potential health impact of climate change in Maine is an increase in vector-borne diseases. A warmer, wetter Maine climate is likely to support increasing populations of ticks and mosquitoes that carry harmful diseases, but only, we should note, where habitat is otherwise suitable and where host populations like white-tailed deer are numerous. Black-legged or deer ticks are established in southern Maine and are increasing in northern Maine. These ticks carry a range of diseases, and we continue to see annual increases in many of them, especially Lyme disease, with a preliminary but record-breaking 2,943 cases reported in 2023. In addition, Lone Star ticks are more common in southeastern and southern central states, but are appearing more frequently in Maine in recent years. And these ticks also carry a range of diseases, including alpha-gal syndrome or red meat allergy, 8 cases of which were identified and reported to Maine CDC in 2023. Human cases of mosquito-borne diseases continue, luckily, to be rare in Maine, but last summer saw notable viral activity, including a veterinary outbreak of eastern equine encephalitis and reports of multiple mosquito populations that carried EEE West Nile virus and Jamestown Canyon virus. We also note that climate change may have an impact on air quality in Maine. And as we all experienced, the East Coast had significant episodes of poor air quality from wildfire smokes last summer, although we were largely spared the worst impacts of these events that were experienced by neighboring states because of favorable weather conditions. However, recent research suggests that although large-scale wildfires remain more common in the Western US, most of the projected health impacts from exposure to that wildfire smoke are likely to occur on the East Coast, and this is because of the higher population density here. So this is not just an issue for Western states to pay attention to, but increasingly an issue that Maine will grapple with in the summers and shoulder seasons. And other climate-related aspects of air quality are also important and worth our attention, including likely increases in pollen and other aeroallergens as the growing season warms and lengthens. Overall, we know that we need better tools to track, understand, and respond to these issues, and Maine CDC is working with the Department of Environmental Protection to develop and publish a wildfire and air quality data dashboard, which you see here in development on this slide, and to implement a statewide pollen monitoring network. And we're hoping that both of these efforts will be up and running by later this summer. Finally, we want to recognize that a changing climate may negatively impact Mainers' food and water resources and lead to outbreaks of food and waterborne diseases. Extreme weather events such as heat waves, damaging storms, and prolonged drought can damage crops or prevent them from growing, which decreases food availability, increases food prices, and contributes to food insecurity. And these, of course, can affect Mainers' food supplies even when the impact is happening remotely and globally and not locally, and impacting farms here in Maine. Drinking water quality can also be harmed by extreme weather patterns, especially flooding and drought. Extreme precipitation and flooding events can wash bacteria into source water bodies, leading to outbreaks of gastrointestinal diseases. Warmer temperatures can contribute to the formation of harmful algal blooms in lakes and in the ocean, which can sicken people and their pets and contaminate fish and shellfish. And periods of drought can impact well water quality, which in turn can lead to depletion of groundwater resources and cause arsenic and other harmful contaminants to become mobilized into the groundwater from bedrock, as well as allowing salt water to infiltrate wells in coastal areas. And in addition, warmer and wetter weather can allow for the spread of harmful marine pathogens, such as Vibrio bacteria. This is the family of pathogens that include the cholera pathogen, and this can contaminate shellfish and cause foodborne illnesses, but can also cause serious and sometimes fatal infections in bathers through contact with open wounds. Recent research that we note in the upcoming report has highlighted the increasing frequency of vibriosis cases in the Mid-Atlantic region in recent decades. And modeling work alongside this surveillance work suggests that as ocean waters warm, vibriosis infections could become more common along the entire East Coast by the end of this century. Understanding all of these risks can help us better prepare for them, and we hope to continue being able to provide tools, resources, and information to Mainers and Maine communities so that they can stay healthy and safe while adapting to a changing climate. And with that, I will stop, and I think we'll take questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Rebecca. And thank you to all of our panelists for doing such a great job of condensing so much information into such a small time period. And we hope that if you have continued interest in any of these topics, that when the full report comes out, you'll be able to dive in a little bit more. So we would love to open it up to questions now. Just a reminder, you can use the Q&A feature, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen, to ask questions, and then we'll field them to the panelists. I don't see any questions right now, but please feel free to get those questions coming, because we can hopefully answer those for you. And I have, I think, a question that I would like to start it off with for all the panelists. I know that an important part of your work in developing the updated scientific assessment is looking at priority information needs. So what else do we need to know, and what are the major areas of research that are ongoing to help us understand climate impacts better? So I wondered if each of you could talk about a couple of what you're seeing as priority information needs in the area that you spoke about, just briefly, so people can, maybe there are students in the audience that are thinking about what they might want to study in grad school or in college. What are those major areas of information needs that the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee has identified?
I'm happy to go first. Thanks, Molly. I'll let Rebecca talk about some of our the working groups information needs as they relate to human health. But the two that we identified for human dimensions on the social and economic side were, I think we're going to need a lot more information about our insurance markets. It seems to be a bit of a black box at this stage. And I alluded to it in one of the slides. I think it's our housing market is already strained, and we, thinking about the future and what that's going to mean when it collides with the insurance markets is largely uncertain. So I think having more foresight into how insurance markets might respond, and also policy that can help to mitigate the negative effects of those responses is important. The other area that we identified was we need a bit more information about the differential levels of vulnerability across the state. So we've identified a few strategies to try to understand how social vulnerabilities intersect with different types of risk in different parts of the state. So that's what we've outlined.
Again, jump in with a few comments. In terms of information needs, there are a number of areas of increased monitoring that would be helpful. And in particular, in relation to extreme weather events, and again, spanning different timescales, to have more information on sub-daily precipitation events. So those events where in a few hours there are 3 or 5 inches of precipitation, because most precipitation analyses historically are using daily data, and we know the daily total, but we don't necessarily know if the precipitation occurred in 2 hours or 5 or 8 hours. And this is important for better understanding risk of infrastructure damage, but also for agriculture and forestry. Likewise, there are drought indicators that could be better monitored through establishing long-term monitoring of soil temperature and moisture. There are very few locations in the state where soil temperature and moisture is monitored for which we have records. And so going forward, to have networks monitoring that in different environments across the state would be very helpful, as well as increased hydrological monitoring, again, in relation to drought and water resources. And I think those are some of the key points, as well as monitoring in relation to lakes, for example, how lake ecology is shifting over time as the climate warms and as the ice cover season diminishes, and how it affects lakes in terms of water quality as well as the broader ecosystem.
And I think from my side, I'll jump on the bandwagon and say we always need and want more monitoring data to be able to help us track things like air quality and water quality as it changes with changing climatic conditions, and want to know more about the factors that can impact health as people are exposed to these changing environments. A couple of other things that we noted specifically in the human dimensions group within the scientific and technical subcommittee is areas where we really hope to see more information come out in the next few years, are around vector-borne diseases. I think one area where we would love to see more research and be able to understand the landscape more fully is around the climatic drivers of the spread of vector-borne diseases, and really better understanding all the factors that drive changes in vector populations, in the behavior and movement of the tick and mosquito populations that carry harmful diseases, but also how changing climatic conditions drive the spread of the diseases from the vectors into human populations. It's just a really complex set of intersecting systems that we don't fully understand, and that will always, I think, be in need of more research. And then one thing that I think a number of us agreed was an area that will impact many of the fields in which we work, and where there's not currently good information that we were available to find, is projections of changes in population and migration into or out of the state of Maine as the national and global climate continues to change, and how best to understand and predict those larger scale population migration patterns, so that all the various sectors of the state, whether it is public health, healthcare, economics, housing markets, insurance markets, will need to respond to changes in population and demographic factors across the state in coming years as a result of global climate change.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing all of those important questions. And hopefully next time around, when the next report comes out, we'll have more information in those areas. Some questions that are coming in through the Q&A. This one I believe is probably for Cindy or Rebecca. Are state or federal labor standards around extreme heat evolving to account for more high heat days for workers?
I can start off there, and Cindy, please feel free to jump in. My understanding is that federal labor standards are starting to catch up with a warming climate and what the implications of that are for workers who work both outdoors and in hot, unconditioned environments. It's never as fast as we would like for labor standards to, keep pace with changing risks in a workplace environment, but I know that it is something that OSHA federally is actively working on. Here in Maine, we at Maine CDC are just at the early stages of designing a better educational outreach effort towards occupational audiences, both workers and employers, around the increasing need for workers in Maine to understand the risks of extreme heat in work settings. And so we're hoping that will fill some of the gaps, at least while we wait for federal standards to make their way through the process.
Great, thank you, Rebecca. So this is a question that I think is probably for Cindy. Climate risk is really tied to many other risks. One good example is that rising housing insecurity and affordability in Maine often decreases people's capacity for climate resilience. Do you have any thoughts on how research into climate issues can best capture these other intersecting social issues?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I was trying to allude to it in the presentation. I think we've gotten to this place where we understand that people are differentially sensitive because of a whole range of different social factors, including housing. I think where we're going to have to start to go is to better understand the root causes of those social vulnerabilities. And so I think having a stronger social science infrastructure to kind of track those down and to think about, okay, how do we alleviate them at their root cause, right? Rather than treating symptoms, but to think about what scholars would refer to as transformative adaptation, right? Where you're really working on development to alleviate those vulnerabilities is definitely the way to go. But first we have to understand how the vulnerabilities were produced in the first place. Thanks for the question.
Thank you. Another one for Rebecca. Do you have enough data to project Maine's future public health trends under the various emission scenarios? Trying to figure out how the Maine of the future, I think that's supposed to say, fits into the national context, or maybe the Maine of the figure. I'm not sure what that means, but hopefully that was enough to go by.
I think so. I'll give it a whack, and we can certainly follow up with clarifications or additional questions if needed. It's a good question and a really hard thing to do. So the short answer is no. We really don't have enough data to project with confidence numbers of expected health outcomes in a variety of future climate emission scenarios, just because the impacts of a changing climate on health are so varied and so complicated. And the health outcomes that we know are climate related, of course, are also related to a lot of other factors. So, heat related illnesses are probably the place where we have the best information, the best understanding of, how future, given future projected temperatures in the state and other, temperature and humidity conditions, what we can expect for heat related deaths and illnesses. Bless you, Cindy. But that's such a small piece of the overall burden of health. We don't have good understanding of the relationship between how warm or how wet the climate has to be in order to produce how many more cases of anxiety and depression or post-traumatic stress disorder, how much change in wildfire smoke will produce, or pollen will produce how many asthma, exacerbations or respiratory deaths. The statistics of those relationships are really complex. All of those health outcomes, with the exception probably of heat-related illnesses, are caused by a lot of other factors. And so I think we can say generally changes in Maine's climate will be less severe probably in terms of their health impact than changes in other parts of the country. But how much less severe, we don't really know. And I think one reason we are concerned about health impacts, even though Maine's climate is generally temperate and relative to the rest of the United States will continue to remain somewhat moderate, is that Maine is not well adapted to things like extreme heat. We are not used to hot conditions. We are not used to extreme storms with a lot of frequency. I think there's a lot of room for catch up in our adaptation and our sort of social structures for protecting Mainers and Maine communities from health impacts when this extreme weather becomes more frequent.
Thanks, Rebecca. This next question, I'm not sure who would want to take this one, but the question is around, has the STS looked at how Maine's proposed climate action, so the policies and the outcomes that have been sort of promoted in Maine Won't Wait and will probably be included in the next climate action plan, how those actions might change health and human dimension outlooks for Mainers. So sort of looking at the impacts of policies and actions on these health and human outcomes.
I can take a first crack at that and then pass it off to my colleagues, but we did not. Though we could have. There are some great methodologies developing for thinking about different climate scenarios and emission scenarios, and then how those translate, for example, into social costs. And so if we have a good understanding of the mitigation potential of our recommendations when they're enacted, then that could be translated into projections, at least, or estimations of future social and economic costs. And there are some scholars who've done that. So it's a great idea. We were working on a bit of condensed timeline this round, but we have grand plans for future work. So I'll pass it off. I'm sure Sean and Rebecca may want to respond to that too.
I'm not sure if I have much to add, but in the climate section, we didn't really tackle that. We haven't tackled that particular issue in seeing how this might change the outlooks, but it's an important issue to try to assess, and so I think we'll be doing that more so in the future.
Okay, thanks. One specific question for Rebecca: how are asthma rates impacted by climate change, and does Maine have a higher level of asthma than other states?
Yeah, thanks. So second part first, yes, rates of asthma in Maine are higher and significantly higher for some demographic groups than they are in other areas of the US. And we know that there are a number of ways in which the environment and a changing climate in specific can impact rates of asthma and exacerbations of asthma for folks that have existing asthma. Primarily, it's gonna, the things we will be most concerned about are exposure to wildfire smoke when other parts of the country or potentially areas within Maine or closer to Maine experience wildfires from dry conditions and buildup of material. The air quality impacts are significant during those events and have real noticeable impacts immediately on rates of visits to emergency departments for asthma exacerbations. The other impact that we have particularly concern for in Maine is pollen and warming. Extended growing seasons due to climate change can cause, and higher atmospheric levels of carbon dioxide can cause more pollen to be released into the atmosphere and to cause all sorts of respiratory and allergic conditions, including exacerbations of asthma. And of some interest, we just recently heard from New York City colleagues that they have looked at data for asthma emergency department rates for the last summer, and saw just as significant a spike in asthma emergency department visits during the peak pollen period in the spring as they did during the wildfire smoke impact in the middle of the summer. And we know that New York City really experienced a significant exposure event from those wildfires. And so, I think pollen is probably an underrated risk factor for folks with asthma and other respiratory conditions, and certainly climate driven. So this is an area where we're really especially looking forward to getting more data available.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca. I think we have about time for one more question, and I think this is a good one to end on. A question for Susie. Maine has a very DIY and self-reliant culture. We are problem solvers. How should Mainers think about incorporating a changing climate into who we are?
I love this question. What this question reminded me of was a conversation that we had at the Coastal and Marine Working Group yesterday. We had the University of Maine's Mitchell Center reporting out on some of the voices that they've attempted to bring into the climate planning process in engaging some priority populations that aren't normally included in climate action planning. And so we talked a lot about equity in climate action. And one of the Coastal and Marine Working Group members, I thought he put it really nicely. He said, equity isn't a project, it's a lifestyle. And that just resonated so much with me. And I feel like my answer to this question is going to be similar, in that climate action isn't a project that we are going to be able to solve really quickly, but it's a change in our lifestyle. And so we have to think about how we can individually take climate action and collectively every day and make that part of our lifestyle. So I think whoever asked the question was quite right about our, do-it-yourself, self-reliant culture here in Maine. And I think that's to our advantage when it comes to taking action on climate.
Great. Thank you so much, Susie. I think that's a good note to end on, and a good thing for us to be thinking about as we go on with our days. Just want to thank the presenters so much for being here with us and taking the time to prepare your slides and to share this really important information. Again, we have 2 more webinars coming up. You can find those on our meeting calendar webpage. And I just wanted to remind folks that if you're interested in continuing to follow the work of the Maine Climate Council and the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee, please subscribe to our newsletter. Ansley will drop that link in the chat so you can make sure that you're on the list to receive the latest updates. And you can also contact the Maine Climate Council at any time. So if you have questions for maybe one of the working groups or for the STS about what you heard today, you can send a message to a specific working group or to the STS through our contact page on our website, and we'll make sure to get a good answer for you. So thank you so much for joining us on this afternoon, and we hope to see you at a future webinar, and have a great rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.